What's Grounded, fam? It's your boy Johnny Gio. Thank you guys for tuning in to the Grounded Phoenix podcast. As always, the purpose of this channel is to express vulnerability and bring awareness to addiction, trauma, and mental health. I have Mike on the mic with me right now. What's Grounded, bro?
How you doing, Johnny? Thank you for having me, man.
I'm doing good, man. Of course. So I was talking to you earlier, and I'm like, damn, I got to figure out a way to edit the audio because I freaking sound like I haven't hit puberty compared to your voice, dog.
Yeah. Well, so I liked our conversation earlier, us talking about, recovery. I love what you're doing here. I love what you're doing for the recovery community. I love what Team 12 is doing. Shout out to Nick. Shout out to Marcos. You guys are doing great stuff. I'm happy to be here, man. Dude, what do you want to know?
All right. So, first of all, I appreciate the shout out, to all the homies in Team 12, Blessed Savages, it's really a dope feeling to be a part of this, and even sitting down next to you, man, because believe it or not, like you play a huge role in this, man. I appreciate you for taking the time to do this. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of growth. Yeah. It takes a lot of growth. Well, to get started, let's dive into what were you like before, the recovery, and what were the turbulence that you had to overcome?
Okay, well, I'm going to talk a little bit. So I'm a heroin addict through and through. Okay. Totally loyal to heroin and all her derivatives. Of course, I've messed around like most of us. I've messed around with everything. But I felt like I could put a lot of that down. Sometimes I get tired of this or tired of that. But as far as heroin and all her little different heroin types, that's really what did it to me. That's what
she's a her.
Down. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Come on.
Gotcha.
Fell in love with her at first sight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what led me up to that, though, right? How does one get addicted to heroin? Like what led me down that path? I was thinking about this on the way here. My first memory, I lived in Tehran as a boy. Okay. Right. My stepfather was an engineer, and I was over there, and so I'm this little guy with big blue eyes and bright blonde hair, and the children there used to follow me around because they'd never seen anything like it. So they would follow me around trying to touch it and trying to make sense of it, you know what I mean? And it just freaked me out. So my first memory is asking my mom if I could carry a stick, right? Because I was scared of what was happening. Even though I wasn't really under any threat, I didn't know how else to cope with this, right? So my go-to, I don't know if I saw it in a cartoon. I mean, it's not like my family's a bunch of people that walk around beating people with sticks every time they're uncomfortable, but that was my first thought. Okay. Right? So I had poor coping skills from the start, right? I didn't know how to cope with the world around me. So I'll fast forward. I was an awkward kid. I was super, super, super shy, and I had a very noisy head, a lot going on in my head. That's kind of where I lived. And when I was about 12, I discovered the punk rock community. Okay. And went to my first show, and I discovered, a music and a culture that was louder and faster than my head. So I fell in love, and just kind of rolled around the punk rock scene for a long time. And the people I hung out with, everybody was doing drugs, everybody was partying, but nobody was doing heroin. Okay. But the music I was listening to and the books I was reading always talked about heroin. And so it kind of gave me this idea that might be something I want to try because I didn't know anything about it. You know what I mean? I'd heard of people doing it, but it had this mystique about it. And so somewhere along the way, again, I don't have very good coping skills. I don't know how to deal with the world. I know that drugs help me cope. And from everything I hear about heroin, I'll bet that's really going to help me cope, And so I did. I found it at 21. I found heroin, and it helped me cope. And then it didn't, Wow. It certainly, it did what I wanted it to do. And within 3 years of first trying it, I had lost everything. I was living on the streets, shooting dope. It was just a day-to-day existence where, nothing else mattered. Food didn't matter. People didn't matter. It was just me and the dope. It was a real simple equation. And I did that for a while until I was about 25. And that's when I knew, after living on the streets for about 2.5 years, that's when I knew I needed to get help.
And that was the first time you reached out for help?
That was the first time. Yeah, I was 25 years old.
So at 25, you got help, but what led you to, because that wasn't the end of it, right?
No, I have several relapses in my story, but that was my first exposure to recovery, and I actually pulled a few years clean off that first one. I was actually I'm from Pasadena, basically, right? I've lived here most of my life, but when I reached out for help, I was living in Tucson, Arizona. I'd like to give a shout out, but I hate the place, so I can't do that.
Nothing like Cali.
Yeah, that's true. So after, living in an abandoned building to abandoned building, I knew that I had to finally do something, and I knew I wanted to come back to Pasadena. So I got a hold of a treatment center here in Pasadena, and they said, well, you got to get back in Cali first before we can, even talk to you. Mm-hmm. So I came back here and lived on the streets here for a little while until I could get into treatment. And that was my first exposure to a solution. What I didn't know at the time was I was going to be given a solution for my poor coping skills in general. It wasn't just taking me away from the drugs. It was going to show me how to deal with the world around me without drugs. And that, for me, that's what recovery is.
And what was that solution? What was the program that you initially got into? So
it's a 12-step based program,
okay.
Right? And that's what I continue to use. That's what works for me when I'm working it. They taught me the spiritual principles of 12-step recovery. I'm working NA, Narcotics Anonymous, but I have mad respect for AA too. I stay out of the Civil War. I don't get into like who's better or who's not.
Right.
I think you got to reach for whatever works for you. So I get into treatment, and I stayed there for about a year, and after that I stayed clean about 8 years. And I applied the principles. I did the things that I was taught there. When I finished treatment, so it's going to date myself, but that was 1996, that first treatment.
It's all good, brother.
All right. I had no skills to speak of, no professional skills. Remember, I'd been living on the streets. I wasn't really doing anything with my life, and I didn't even know how to turn a computer on. And it turns out that I had kind of a natural skill for it. So over the next 5 years, while I was clean, I built a really nice career in technology. I worked for big corporations. I had a private contract with the governor of California at the time. I worked in television. I mean, you name it. And I was making good money, and I was pretty happy. Things were going pretty smooth. But I always had my recovery. I always had my program there with me. Nothing came before that until something came before that. And that's when I had my first relapse. I have 8 years clean, and I went out with 8 years.
What was that? What was that to cause you to relapse? Was it the environment? Initially, what triggered you?
Well, the short answer to that is it was ego and pride. But I'll tell you what it was. I got involved with a company. I was asked to help start a company at 7 years clean. And it was an opportunity to make a lot of money. And so I put my everything into this company. In the back of my mind, I felt like I'm just this street junkie with no college education, right? Who's working really hard to make a living, and so I really have to prove myself. And so I worked 19-hour days with these guys, stopped going to meetings. It's the same story we always hear. I stopped going to meetings, stopped calling my sponsor, stopped doing the things that got me to a position where I could work in the first place, right? I think that's an important one there. I was taking my program for granted. Like, oh, this will always be here. Mm-hmm. I can put this on hold, I can put it aside, and I'm gonna go do this other thing, And it was in an industry that's not super healthy to begin with. It was an adult film company, right? Yeah. Shout out to sex workers. I'm not saying anything against that, but that can get pretty dark in some ways.
We're gonna have to talk about that after.
Yeah, I'll give you a follow-up.
There you go.
They ended up firing me after a year, right? I helped start this company, and they let me go. And the basic gist was, the department that I was running really smoothly, and they were like, why do we, we're paying you all this money, what do we need you for? Everything's like a well-oiled machine. Why don't you kick rocks? So, this this passion of mine, this thing I'd helped start, rejected me, right? And so what my head told me, I went back to my old poor coping mechanisms. My head told me, you know what? You aren't what you thought you were. You really are just a junkie. You know what I mean? But you had no business playing around in business and trying to make money. Like, you're really a failure. You get just all this really horrible dialogue.
Right.
And because I had no program, and I wasn't going to meetings, and I wasn't doing the things to take care of myself, I believed it. I believed what my head was telling me. And I think it was the day after I got loaded, I had a needle in my arm. It was that quick, because I had no coping, no way to deal.
What do you think replaced what initially helped you get clean? Because it seemed like all your time was consumed by this job that initially, at the end, ended up rejecting you. Do you think the 12 steps ended up being the money,
It's an interesting question. I think it was a number of things, right? I was a partner in this company, so I was getting a lot of validation. I was in a relationship at the time, so I wasn't messing with the talent, but I was getting a lot of attention from the talent. So there was just this constant validation. And this idea that everything's fine, I'm okay. They say so, you know, even though I wasn't okay,
right.
you know. Yeah, I would say it was the constant validation, and the money was a big part of it. I was making really good money. When I relapsed, I had about $13,000 in the bank, you know. I was saving money, things were going pretty well. That relationship actually ended right before I got fired. She was tired of me being around other naked women. She couldn't really hang with it. And I was so laser focused and so selfish that I didn't see how this was hurting her. You know, even though I didn't mess with the talent, I was always loyal to her. I still didn't see the damage it was causing.
Right. And I mean, and you thought you were doing good for yourself, and you knew you were loyal, you know.
Yeah.
So before we get into like the recovery aspect, because that's something I really want to touch on, because you have such an incredible story. Can you give us some perspective of what your rock bottom was, or like what was your lowest low that you hit?
I've got a few. All right, I guess this one works. During my relapse, and I'm going to talk about that first relapse, about 2 years into it, I was staying up in Thousand Oaks, but my dope connection was in Hollywood. And one day, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was heading to go get some dope on the 101 freeway, and I wrecked my bike in the fast lane.
Oh.
You know, I basically got bounced down the freeway under a 600-pound motorcycle. And, you know, a lot of adrenaline. I mean, my shoulder had exploded. I was in pretty bad shape. My clothes were all torn, but I didn't care. From the side of the freeway, I called somebody to finish the mission. I wasn't worried about a hospital. I wasn't worried about, you know, brain damage or anything. I was standing upright, so let's keep going.
I mean, you're a solid dude, man. Shit, I feel bad for the bike.
I'll tell you that. I wasn't at the time. You know what I mean? When I'm using, I'm not solid at all.
Okay.
I was about 50 pounds lighter. But I showed up at the connections house, and I remember telling him, I knocked on his door, my clothes are all torn, and I said, you know, this happened on my way to see you, so it's your fault and you owe me. Right?
Whoa.
Really like twisted addict logic, right? I'm making a mess of my life, and you need to do something about it. You know what I mean? He kicked me down an issue, I think, just to get him off his front porch. You know, like he just wanted me to get out of there.
Yeah. Like,
but that's definitely one of the low points. I think that's definitely one of the low points. The story goes on. I mean, I went to the hospital that night, and they x-rayed my shoulder, and so they sent me away with a bottle of Vicodin, and I took the whole bottle that night, and I went back the next day and asked them for more. And they said, how many did you take? And I said, all of them. And so they started taking my clothes off, and they were, you know, checking me and poking and prodding me, and it turns out my liver was failing.
bro, you were not fucking around.
No, my liver was in the process of failing, and they admitted me, and they said, you know, you have a 50-50 chance of leaving this hospital. You need to start making arrangements. And I was 36 years old, and I was like, what do you mean make arrangements? I felt fine.
Right.
You know? It was all the acetaminophen in the Vicodin. I had overdone it, and almost died from it. But, you know, there are a lot of miracles along the way. Like, I don't understand how I survived that motorcycle accident. I don't understand how I survived that hospital stay, but I did. You know, but we'll talk about that later.
Right, dude. I'm really glad you're okay, and you know, God bless. You know, thank God you're good. So, you know, let's move forward to the recovery aspect,
cool.
Man. Can you explain or just talk more about your early recovery and really go into depth how you felt, like initially, you know, the first couple months, what you had to do, what was your thought process during those moments?
I know the first couple of months, you know, in treatment was really just about like being grateful to have a plate of food, because, you know, I'd been homeless for a long time. Grateful to have a roof over my head, grateful to have a bed to sleep in. But what began to happen is I began to develop relationships with people, right? And that was something I didn't really have, even in my first run with heroin. You know, it's just I was out there doing it alone. And even the times that I've relapsed, you know, that first relapse when I had all that money in the bank, I paid off a bunch of bills and I bought a bunch of drugs and sat in there for 3 months alone. So connecting to people, making these relationships, that was what I began to see one of the real values of recovery. You know, it also having these relationships with people gave me a better understanding of myself. You know, I started to connect to people who are like-minded and who were facing the same problems, the same pain that I was, and I would get close to them, and then we began to sort of reflect on each other, and we began to learn about ourselves through one another. And I still think connections in recovery are the most important.
Yeah, I think so too. What do you remember initially? What were some triggers for you? Some like really big triggers that kind of like got you, aside from not doing your step work. Like, what were some triggers that might help somebody avoid that?
For me, my biggest trigger is always around work. Right, I have this. Not so much anymore because I've done some work in that area. But the times that I've relapsed, behind every relapse, there's a job story. Right. So my ego gets real wrapped up in the work that I'm doing, and my pride gets wrapped up in it. Again, because I don't really have a college education. I come from the street, and I've worked really hard to build something, and that right there becomes my higher power: the job, the work, the prestige.
That's big right there.
Relationships, I know for a lot of people, can be really triggery. They're not too much for me. I certainly have felt an overinflated sense of rejection. I think that's normal for addicts and alcoholics, but it's never been something that really takes me out. The things that have taken me out are always around work and professional prestige.
Okay.
It's a big one for me.
Yeah, and I see that, like, for me, I can definitely relate to you because inflating my ego with like things I have accomplished, ignoring, writing in my journal and, putting stuff down on paper, it gets me to think different ways and not really reflect as much. Mm-hmm. So I know that you work in recovery.
I do.
So you have an understanding of pause.
I do.
So do you mind elaborating on that and how that might have impacted you, or just kind of shed light of pause to people that might not know about it?
I don't mind at all. And I'm glad you brought it up. I think it's something that doesn't get talked about enough. So what Johnny's talking about is post-acute withdrawal syndrome, PAWS. And if you break it down, right, post-acute basically just means after serious or after severe. So after the severe withdrawal, there's some stuff that happens. And I wish people had pointed this out in my first recovery, but I definitely experienced it not too long ago. I'm going to be jumping around in time.
That's cool, man.
But
yeah, that's cool.
I had a really serious relapse in 2016 that lasted about a year, and I went back to treatment and I finished that, and I was clean for about 22 months, I think, and I was experiencing pause that whole time, but I didn't know it. I didn't have a name for it. I just knew I was really uncomfortable. I was really out of sorts. It didn't make sense to me. It's like, well, I'm clean, I'm doing the right thing. How come I'm still uncomfortable in my skin? And what we need to understand is that we're putting some really powerful stuff into our brain, and it takes time. It really takes time to get over that. So some of the things for me, my number one character defect and symptom of pause was anger. I think that was always my go-to. I mean, I was a little kid who wanted to carry a stick, to keep people away. I've just sort of always been built that way. But also, some depression, some confusion, memory problems, that sort of thing. Those were the symptoms of pause. Once I learned about it, it was like, okay, this all starts to make sense now. I need to really be kind to myself. I need to understand that this is going to take time. Just because I'm done with withdrawal, the dope kick is over. Right. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It can get tricky.
Is it in a sense, like reaching like equilibrium, like a balance within ourselves?
That's a great way to put it. That's really what it is. It's getting back to equilibrium or stasis, right? Our normal healthy state. And I hear a lot of different variations. Some people say pause can last as long as 10 years. Some people say it's about 18 months.
Well, 10 years. I didn't know that.
Yeah, but I think when you say that, you have to understand that probably applies to like a hobo who's been drinking since he was 13 and got sober at 80. Okay. His pause is going to take a really long time, right?
So it varies.
Right. I think that the sweet spot, the most common time frame, is probably about 18 months. Okay. That was what I experienced when I talked to a lot of people about it, who are in tune with it. That's about what they say too.
Sweet, dude. Thank you for elaborating on that, because I just read up on it. I'm not going to act like I fully knew about that shit, but I think it's important for the viewers to understand that and how it does play a role in recovery.
Absolutely.
Next thing I want to talk about is, acceptance and admitting that you are powerless over your addiction. And that's a fucking tough pill to fucking swallow. Yeah. And you had to do that multiple times, dude. Like, where did you find the strength for that? how do you wrap your head around it? What would be your best advice for somebody going through that?
That is a really tough question, because acceptance is one of the most powerful tools in recovery. I think it's powerful in life, but the rub is that as addicts and alcoholics, we really need to learn things the hard way. You know what I mean? I didn't really think about my situation until I'm getting bounced down the freeway underneath a motorcycle, and I thought, well, maybe, you fix this, right?
Crossover.
So acceptance doesn't come easily to us. It's not natural, but it, again, like I said, it plays a vital role in our recovery. If you can, the thing about step one, which is basically what you're talking about, the rest of the steps are there as a solution. But that doesn't matter if you can't identify the problem.
Right.
And so I have to really accept that, you know what, I can't put these chemicals in my body, I can't put anything in my body that changes my state of mind, because I become a different person. It triggers my addiction. And I have to accept that. I have to accept that about myself. It took me a long time to be comfortable talking about being a heroin addict. Just using it like, okay, that's part of who I am. But once I did that and accepted it, it's amazing how smooth sort of the rest of the steps and the rest of recovery goes. You say, okay, this is my situation. I have to get real about it. And of course, we talk about acceptance in other areas of life on a day-to-day basis, and it can be helpful and powerful, and we can also be stubborn.
Right.
When that happens.
What's the difference between saying it and writing it down and then really feeling it? Is there a difference?
For me, I find I'm really doing acceptance well. I'm really taking action of acceptance when I'm uncomfortable.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I'm all about what I want, not what I need, but what I want. And when I don't get what I want, I get uncomfortable. And then if I can let that go, there's some discomfort there. When I just say, you know what, I have to accept the situation for what it is. I have to accept this person for who they are. I have to accept, whatever's in front of me. It can be uncomfortable for a moment, and that's when I know I'm doing it right.
I like the way you put that. I really think that's the fucking truth, because I can really relate to that. Let's talk about inventory. Because there's some stuff that I had to write down that I know helped me, but getting it off my chest and off my mind and off my heart and soul onto paper, I know really helped me, but it was difficult, especially some traumatic experiences as a child. Can you just elaborate how that helped you? And then also, what was the toughest thing you had to write down and really come to terms with?
To answer the first part of the question, I think addicts and alcoholics are some of the most sensitive people I've ever known.
Facts.
We're very, very sensitive. When we harm another person, when we do someone wrong, we know that, right? And we carry that around, and I think it eats at us. So the whole inventory process is designed it's like rocks in a backpack. You want to carry that around the rest of your life. And so you do inventory, and you kind of unload a rock at a time, and it gets lighter and lighter. You're asking me the question about my toughest, and I have one. It's immediately, I already know what it is, and I've done way too many inventories.
Hey, at least you're doing them.
And none of them are easy, but this one, all right, I'll give you a little background. When I relapsed in 2016, I was living with a woman I was just deeply, deeply in love with. And it was pretty clear to both of us we were going to eventually get married and build a life together, but I had fucked up. So that relapse lasted about a year, and God bless her, she hung in as much as she could, but finally, she couldn't deal with it anymore. So I literally upended her entire life. We had a plan, and I derailed that plan with my behavior. So, excuse me, when I got clean after that, when I went into treatment, it was like a boulder. I talked about rocks in a backpack. This was huge. And it was big enough that I stayed away from anything remotely like a relationship for about 2.5 years. I wouldn't go near anybody because I didn't ever want to do that to somebody again. It was two parts. I wanted to make sure I was right, and I also didn't want to harm anybody in the way that I harmed her spiritually.
And that's tough to do given the human needs that we have.
It was, it was really tough, but it was also still something, that cut really deep. I was really aware of what I had done, and it was to the point where she's also in recovery, and I was avoiding meetings that I thought she might go to. There were certain parts of LA I wouldn't go around because I was worried I would see her, because I just didn't know what would happen if I saw her. And It played a role. It was constantly in the front of my mind. It was constantly there. And thank God, my sponsor finally, he knew the history on this. He had done my 4th step with me, or my 5th step. He'd seen my 4th step. He knew the situation, and there was kind of a moment in time where he said, "All right, it's time to make this amends. It's time to fix this." Oof. And the way he handled it, though, man, he's a champ. He's probably the best sponsor I've ever had. He kind of did it in steps, and he was kind of sneaky about it, but in a really healthy way. And he had me write out what I was going to say to her. First, he came to see me. We were supposed to be doing step work, and then he switched it up. He said, "How about you write that letter?" I said, "Okay, all right." So I wrote the letter, and it took about an hour and a half. It's a couple of pages.
Wow.
And I read it to him. And he said, "That's great, fix this, take that out." He kind of helped me shape it, He wanted to make sure it had just the right tone to it and that I said what I needed to say. And so I'm done with it, and he said, "Yeah, that's good." And I thought, cool, and I folded it up to put it away. He said, "All right, now text her." Wait, what? Right now?
Yeah.
But I think it was best that he came at me like that, so I didn't really have time to think about it.
And you were uncomfortable, right?
Really uncomfortable, but I knew it had to be done. Mm-hmm. As much for her as me, but mainly for me. I had to let this go, So I reached out and we connected the next day. The funny thing about amends that I think a lot of people hear in recovery is you don't want to say you're sorry, right? Because as addicts and alcoholics, our loved ones have heard "I'm sorry" so many times. It doesn't mean anything anymore. Mm-hmm. So I had crafted this letter, and what I wanted to say very, very carefully, that I hit every note that I could, but I never used "I'm sorry." So we connected on the phone. This is right at the beginning of the whole COVID lockdown, so we had to do this over. I wanted to do it in person, but we did it over the phone. Mm-hmm. So I talked for about an hour and a half. I just everything I could think of, copying to every single thing I was sure I had done, and maybe some things I wasn't even sure, because I was loaded. I couldn't remember. And when I was done talking, she said, "This is God's sense of humor, right?" She said, "I know how important words are for you, and I know you took that very serious, and you really thought that out, and I appreciate that." And I had said at the end of it, I said, "Is there anything I left out, and is there anything I can do to make this right?" And she said, "So I liked what you said, and I heard what you said, but I really have only been wanting to hear 2 words from you." Okay, let me guess. "I'm sorry." She said, "Yeah, that's all I've ever wanted to hear from you." I thought that's interesting because she's in recovery too.
Yeah,
right?
That's kind of ironic.
Yeah, it is, and it kind of threw me. But I thought, okay, well, and then what I told her was, if you want me to call you every day for the next year and just say "I'm sorry" and then hang up, like if that'll make you feel better, I'll do that. And she laughed and she said, no. She said, I get that you really feel bad and that you do see the whole picture. She let me off the hook. What really blew me away, Johnny, was that she ended up making amends of her own. She owned up to some parts in the whole situation that I don't even know if I saw them, but she acknowledged them and she talked about what she could have done better.
That's dope. Killing 2 birds with 1 stone right there.
Right? Never saw that coming. What happened after that conversation was I was lighter and freer than I can remember being in a long time. It was like that. Finally, the biggest rock in the backpack was gone.
That shit was gone.
Yep.
There might have been some pebbles in there.
Maybe. Who knows? But not that one was out. And we don't talk. We don't communicate. I told her, I might see her at a meeting. I'm not going to stop myself from going to meetings anymore that she might be at. And she said, "That's not a problem." And it felt really genuine. We had a really genuine interaction. It felt very comfortable. And, I just wished her the best. And that was it.
Dude, but that's a touching story, man. It's very moving, too. And one thing I do want to ask, though, is how do you say "I'm sorry" without saying "I'm sorry"?
You acknowledge your part, right? You acknowledge your part. And what it was you did wrong, So I acknowledged stealing from her, betraying her, lying to her. For years I walked around saying, "Hey, I'm the guy that's never cheated on a woman," right? Because I haven't, not with another woman.
Okay.
And that was a point of pride for me. But I had to get real with myself and understand that if cheating is defined by breaking the rules of the relationship, you break the agreement. Right? If we agree we're not going to sleep with other people and then one of us does, that's cheating.
Right.
We agreed that we weren't going to get loaded. And I did. And I betrayed her and I lied to her and I manipulated her in order to keep doing what I wanted to do. That's cheating, plain and simple. So I can't be that guy anymore. And I acknowledged that for her. I let her know that I see that, and that I don't ever want to repeat that, because that's what the gist is of I'm sorry. I'm sorry just simply means I don't want to do that anymore.
Okay.
And I meant it, still mean it.
Dude, I could hear it in the tone of your voice, bro. I'm proud of you, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really proud of you, dude.
Thank you.
Let's move on to, let's talk about spirituality now.
Okay.
To be quite honest with you, I was never really spiritual myself, Is there a way for you to put it into words? Because I know I can't. Like, what is that feeling like for you?
I had to really accept a connection to a higher power, right, before I could describe the feeling. And how I came to do that, I had to really get real with myself about some of the things that I've lived through, right? I mean, you don't survive a motorcycle crash. Like, I survived this motorcycle crash. I had nothing to do with that, surviving it, right? Walking out of the hospital that night, or not that night, but after a few days, surviving what the doctor told me I just might not survive. Dodging an 18-year prison sentence because of my drug use. I got wrapped up in some stuff and managed to avoid that. So I have a whole list of things where I look back and I say, you know what, I had nothing to do with me surviving that.
Yep.
I have to acknowledge something. I don't know what it is or what I'm supposed to be doing, but something wants me here longer. In spite of my best efforts, something wants me to hang around a little longer. So I had to acknowledge that. I don't really belong to any particular religion. I do pray, I do meditate, not enough, as my sponsor knows, and he's going to hear this. Okay, so one of the ways I acknowledge spirituality, and this is my own super personal thing, I don't kill spiders, right? So if I'm in the house and I'm hanging out with a girl and there's a spider and she freaks out, I will spend an hour chasing it out of the house, whatever I got to do. Because when I kill it, I feel like a bully. The thing's not a threat to me. It's not my place. But more importantly, it was done for me.
Wow.
Do you understand?
Wow.
And I have to acknowledge that. And so I will take the time to basically say to the universe, you know what, I'm gonna honor this life because it was done for me.
Yo.
And that's I had
crazy.
to find my own path. That's something that I found on my own, and it works for me. I was 1 year. So when I relapsed in 2016, it was after I had been fired from a job I really liked, and it was on my birthday.
Fuck.
Fucking poor me. You know what I mean? So the next day I had a needle in my arm. Well, I was smoking it. Whatever. I got loaded. This year I also got fired on my birthday. And I had to look at that and say, okay, maybe my God is actually being that blunt and saying, let's try this again. Let's do this again and try doing something different. Don't get your pride all wrapped up in it. Don't get your ego. Don't no self-pity, and definitely don't get loaded. Because no matter what dumpster fire you're facing, you're not going to put it out with dope or alcohol. And that's the lesson I learned the first time around. So when it came around again, and it felt very much like it did that first time, I realized, no, I have a solution. I can do something different. And the last thing I need to do is get loaded. And I'm still clean.
Congratulations on that, bro.
Thank you.
You're definitely a prime example of, recovery. Relapse is part of the recovery. Is working in recovery, something that's helping you out as in terms of like, keeping you sober and cleaned? And how do you feel, spending time and giving back to people that, with your experience and growth and wisdom?
Working in recovery is not my recovery. I have a completely separate program to take care of myself. But what I'm doing differently this time around is I literally changed careers. Like you pointed out in the beginning, I do work in recovery now. I don't work in technology like I used to. And I do that to give back, right? Because there were a lot of people along the way that helped me and went out of their way to help me. And the best way for me to acknowledge that is now to do the same for others. Excuse me. I love what I do. I love working with others. But like I said, it's very important for me, and I think those of us that work in treatment and that work in recovery, it's very important to acknowledge that that is not our recovery.
I was going to say that.
It's we have to have our own separate program, and I do. I have my own separate personal program. You know, my boss is not my sponsor. My sponsor is my sponsor. My groups or meetings that I attend with the clients are not my meetings where I get my recovery. They're not my support group, you know. And it feels good that, look, I've made a lot of bad decisions in life, you know, and it feels really good that those don't have to go to waste. I can take those stories and spin it into a way to help people.
Right.
You know, which is ultimately what I'm trying to do here, and what I think you're doing.
And dude, I'm like really touched by what you just said, because I, in a sense, gotta check myself where it's like, this isn't your recovery, you know. Even though I do feel like I'm helping and it kind of is helping myself, you're absolutely right. I cannot rely on this.
Right.
I can't rely on it. You know, I got to be doing my own things on the side, and that's an important point that you made, and I really appreciate that. Now, before you go, I do want to ask you one final question.
Okay.
And that is that I believe there's 3 things in life that are guaranteed. They're marked in our gravestone, actually, and that is our birthday, the day we passed, and there's something that we overlook, and that's the dash in the middle. What does the dash in the middle represent for you, and like, how do you want to be remembered by when you're gone?
And now I see why you didn't want me to hear that question earlier. Wow. I think just that I made a difference to somebody, right? That I helped somebody, that I didn't just spend my time wasting other people's time. You know, that I made some kind of a difference.
No, I feel that.
Yeah.
I feel that.
That's what that dash is.
Being of service to other people, and the things that you've been through in life, you know, you can use that to help others, just like you said.
Right.
You know, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for stopping by, man. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah.